minutes when we get to play. All right, welcome. So, the first part, all the units are up there. I would like you guys to listen and then emphasize, like, in other words, I'm going to tell you what's important. I'm going to tell you the things you need to adhere to specifically. And if you have any follow-up questions, feel free to, okay? So biomechanics is basically application of mechanics to biological systems. And we're humans, we're biological systems. Biology is just living chemistry. But you could be a biomechanist and work with horses and dogs, and like there's a lot of cool different ways to apply your physics to living things. It's not just humans, although a majority of us are going to be working with humans. It's not all. One of my former students, soccer player, she works with animals. She applies her biomechanics to puppy dogs and kitty cats. It's really cool. Okay, so the combination of the mechanics to the biology is what makes us unique. Biomechanics can be broken down into two different concepts, kinetics and kinematics. You need to know the definitions of each. Kinetics are force variables, pushes and pulls and gravity and friction and muscles. Y'all know Newton's second law, F is equal to ma? That summarizes all of biomechanics. Dr. Madsen, who you're going to hear me talk a lot about, the most brilliant engineer I've ever, that dude was saying stuff. I'm like, I don't know what this dude's talking about. But he really tried to keep it simple. He's like, all we do is apply F is equal to ma. That's it. And what's cool about it is the F of that equation is kinetics, forces. There's different kinds. And then the right side is the kinematics. Kinematics is movement variables, things that deal with movement. Position, where are you at? Remember in anatomical, what's your joint position? That's a kinematic variable. Motion, where are you going? We did a lot of that in 310. That's a kinematic variable. Acceleration, your rate of speeding up or slowing down. That's a kinematic variable, okay? So know the difference between kinetics and kinematics. Guys, it's just like ab and abduction. I'm sorry, but they sound so close together, it gets confusing. Kinetics and kinematics, same thing. Keen, kinetics, forces, kinematics, movement. Here's a breakdown. I love this diagram. I'm going to ask you something on the test. Sometimes I get crushed because I don't give, hey, you need to learn. Just know this, because I'm going to ask a couple questions. But it's an easy breakdown. Biomechanics. Force stuff. Movement stuff. Sorry, force stuff, movement stuff. It's kind of blurry when I'm looking at it with an electron microscope. Remember in 310, there's two types of motion, right? Rotational and straight line. That's this list. Within movement, we have straight line movement variables, such as position, velocity, acceleration. And we have rotational concepts such as angular position, angular velocity, angular acceleration. And if you're like, well, I don't know what angular position is. Yeah, you do. We did it a lot in 310. Being flexed, being extended, that's a rotational position. The faucet being open is an angular position. Faucet being closed is an angular position. Okay? So in 310, we emphasize the difference between straight line and rotational. All this chart does is just kind of break it down more in detail. Movement, forces. Forces influence motion. What was our big thing from 310? Muscles influence motion through contraction. Muscles influence motion. Okay? And then I love this, like kinesiology, the study of kinesiology is like putting all that into a gumbo and applying it all together, right? So in other words, a gumbo tastes like gumbo, but it's made up of several different ingredients. It's kind of a weird concept, but it's not. Like a cake is a cake, but it's made up of individual pieces. So there's these individual pieces that we put together to practice our fields and whatever we're into. Personal training, occupation, whatever your field is. This practical application is a gumbo pot of all these different variables. scalars and vectors. This should be a review for most of you. If you don't, then ask a question. But scalar quantities are magnitude only. Vector quantities have magnitude and direction. Why does direction matter? For communication. $100 is $100. It's a magnitude. But who owns it? Who gives it direction? You know, you write a check to pay a bill, right? The magnitude is on the check, but the direction is the bank takes from me and gives to you. The direction of that money gives it practicality, gives it purpose. Okay? So the reason vectors have that direction is so that we can balance our checkbook. Like, think about it. If your bank statement, I don't know, do people still get bank statements? Like, I might be old school, but like you get a thing from the bank, notice it'll have deposits with positive and withdrawals with a negative. They can't just tell you the magnitude alone. They have to give it direction so that you can do math with it and see what your remainder is, see your balance. It's the same concept, just with velocities and accelerations and positions. Even though that may sound crazy, it's really not. If I'm running into a wind, that's going to affect me differently than if I'm running with the wind, right? Like, direction of these forces matter. Another easy example is up-down forces can only influence up-down motion. I can't push something across and make it go up. If I want to lift the computer up, I have to give it a force up. Pushing it across isn't going to make it go up. That easy concept is what we're talking about here. Why vectors matter with direction. F is equal to ma, but it has to be in the same direction. X forces influence X motion, Y forces influence Y motion. And what's cool is, I think I mentioned it last class, we're going to have a lot of muscles that have these combinations, right? So that they can have some sagittal pull and some frontal pull and some transverse pull. But that's what the difference between scalars and vectors are. And here I have some examples. And again, guys, it's so nitpicky sometimes. Speed is a scalar. Why? Because it doesn't matter your direction. So in other words, if the police officer clocks you going, 70 and a 50, the fact that you were going east, west, north, south didn't matter. It was just about your speed. Vectors are technically velocities and displacement. If you go 60 miles down I-10, someone's giving you directions and they say, oh, just get on I-10, go 60 miles, you're going to be there. Whoa, whoa, whoa. Am I going this way or am I going that way? Does that make sense? So like length is just miles. I jogged 5 miles. It didn't matter your direction. But if you're trying to communicate direction in terms of displacement, direction matters. You got to go 10 miles north and then 2 miles east, and then, right? So that's how, and we do it all the time in the real world. That's why we give those kind of north on Johnson Street. That's a practical example of a vector quantity, as opposed to just saying 10 miles on Johnson Street by itself. Make sense? So with vectors, it's magnitude and direction. I give the check analogy. The magnitude is right there, and the direction is who are you giving it to? Guys, physics is intimidating. But in the real world, we're never going to, I say never, that's not fair. Rarely are we going to actually ever solve for X. However, we need to know how different variables affect other variables. If you work out consistently, your strength is going to go up. Like, you don't have to work out an equation. You just know that if I do this, this is going to happen. And sometimes those variables are directly proportional. What that means is that if you increase one variable, another variable is going to also go up. Strength and weight is a good example. What's the secret to lifting heavy? Lift heavy, right? As you increase the weight, your strength is going to go up. They're directly proportional. The harder one, it's not going to be hard by the time we play through this, is inverse proportional concepts. As one goes up, another variable could go down. As you exercise, as your exercise goes up, maybe your resting heart rate goes down, or maybe your ventilations go down. In the case of like Newton's second law, if you have a car full of friends and it runs out of gas and they all get out, you decrease the mass of the car, makes it easier to accelerate the car. You're going to have a greater acceleration. So my job is to teach you how variables affect each other with an equation, not necessarily to solve the equation. And you know what? Now, especially with equations, solve anything with this. But that doesn't mean you understand what's happening, right? Underneath, when you open up the hood, we need to know how different pieces are affecting other pieces. So that's what it's mostly about. So I give an example here, guys, of direct proportionality. With any equation, the left side, if you say equals the right side, 20 has to equal 20. 20 can't equal 21. So I could say 20 is 20. I could say 20 is 4 times 5. I could say 20 is 10 times 2. That means the same thing, right? So let me show you direct and inverse proportionality. If I change this variable to, let's say, 5, I increase this variable to 5. That means this variable has to also go up. Now this has to become 25. That's a direct proportionality. If I increase the right side of the equation, I have to increase the left side. Inverse proportionality is cool. That's when two variables are on the same side. They have to cancel out, in other words. We did cancel out stuff in 310. So if 20 equals 20, if this goes up to 5 and this has to stay 20, what does this one have to do? Go down to 4. Rocket science. We have to just understand how different variables affect other variables. I'm never going to ask you to solve for x. I'm just going to ask you to understand how different variables affect other variables. All right, guys. In my opinion, one of the most important concepts to understand, and I'm just being transparent. Some students get it quicker than others. But it doesn't matter if you get it quick. What matters is you get it. Guys, I didn't learn to ride a bike till I was like 12. But I was riding. Okay? All right, I'll lie. I wasn't 12. I was like 14. Took me a while. There is a difference. Go back to our diagram of linear and rotational. There is a difference between linear forces and rotational forces. Huge difference. Before I get into the details, I want to give you some practical examples. Things that I know you know. Your life data knows this. If you had 20-pound dumbbells and you had them at your side, and you take those 20-pound dumbbells and you hold them out to your side, it doesn't feel the same, right? This is a lot harder. The weight didn't change. The mass of your arm didn't change. Because it's not about the weight. Weight is a linear force. It's about the torque, the moment. Torque is rotational force. They use the word torque in physics and engineering. We use the word moment. It's the same word. We use the word moment in biomechanics. There's terms like moment of inertia, rotational forces. So why is it that this is harder than this? Because the rotational forces change. We're going to get into that. I'm going to teach you. But as the rotational force increases, my muscles have to increase their pull. They have to work harder to counter the greater rotational force. Guys, not every force is trying to spin something. I apply a force specifically in a certain direction to open this door. But if I apply a force right here, so you know there's something involved with the placement, the direction of that force. Or what if I push, this would be fun, what if I push here? Not every force is trying to spin something. There's a difference between linear force and rotational force. So what is torque? Torque is a rotational force, a force that is trying to spin something. How does a force try to spin something? By having a moment arm. A force that is perpendicular. That's the key word here. That force is applied perpendicular to the axis of rotation. Notice there's a difference between perpendicular and parallel, right? I mean, we guys know that parallel is in the same direction, perpendicular is at a right angle, right? So in other words, I'm all about practical. If you go to a merry-go-round and there's a bunch of kids waiting for you to spin it so they can have fun, and you go to the merry-go-round, let's say this is the merry-go-round, and you just push into the axis of the merry-go-round, those kids are going to boo you, right? Boo this man. You're pushing, but you're not trying to rotate it. You're not creating a moment. So what do? You apply your force, not parallel to the axis, but perpendicular to the axis. Now the force is trying to rotate the merry-go-round. Direction matters. It's a specific perpendicular force to the axis of rotation. You go to open your bottle or your jar of mayonnaise, you can't just do this. You have to rotate it. You have to give it a torque. You have to give it a moment. You're applying a rotational force that's perpendicular to the axis. It's just like a merry-go-round. You don't want to just squeeze it. You don't want to just push. You don't want to just pull. You have to spin. It's not the force. It's the moments. Now, what are some things that create moment? Gravity can create moment. Our muscles can create moment as well. Okay? But that's the first thing. I'm just planting the seed. I'm introducing you to a very important concept called moment, rotational force. Okay? Some other types of forces. Pushes and pulls. Not going to worry about that. However, what's cool about springs is, you know how like with a spring, it can load and then you get some return on that energy, right? Some of our muscles do that too, like our Achilles, like it gets loaded and it builds up stored energy and then we could get some return on that energy. So although it's not the same, we can kind of get some springy effects with some of our muscles. Drag force, that's like running into the wind. Don't really care about much of that. This is a big one, friction. Friction influences us a lot. Friction from the ground, friction from, you think about, holding on to a bat. Why do you think basketball players and pitchers try to keep their hands dry, right? Like with talc, so that they can increase the friction on these things to influence these motions. We're going to get into that more in detail, how friction forces work. Guys, normal force is a fancy way of basically saying push. I'm standing on the ground. The normal force is the direct compression, the direct push. Friction is the perpendicular component of that. So it's kind of one of those things where normal with friction kind of form this combination resultant force. But that's all normal force is. It's just the direct compression. If I'm leaning against a wall, the normal force would be how much of that wall is pushing back on. We're going to go into details of this. And then these are my favorite ones, man. These freaky non-contact moves. Don't care, right? The strong and weak nuclear. Don't care to this class. Very much care. This affects us every day. Okay? The key thing about gravity, I'm not here to explain how it works or why it works. It's crazy stuff, man. Warping of space-time. This is the main thing I need us to understand about gravity. We feel planet Earth as we perceive pulling down on us, every particle of our body, every atom. We summate all of those little particles and we represent it with one big whatever your weight is. but that's the adding. It's like having a bucket of water, and the weight of that water is the sum total of all the little molecules of water, right? So we have our weight is the sum total of all that stuff. It's not the ground that's pulling up on us. It's the center of this planet. 3,000 to 4,000 miles in the middle. That's what's tugging on us. It's not the ground. If I had a hole in the ground, I can go through the hole. I don't stop. The ground stops me from going visit the center of the planet. But it's literally Earth. All right? All right, guys, let's get into some moments. One of the main things that I'm going to teach you guys in this class that I'm going to emphasize over and over is that we have been introduced to muscles as only rotational influencers. Muscles influence motion through contraction, that's true. But they don't just influence our motion. Muscles are really important for joint stability, really important. Think of it like this: if you ever take some heavy dumbbells, whatever heavy is for you, and you take those dumbbells off, you feel your bicep puff up and you feel your tricep puff up. You know what I'm talking about? When you go heavy, like you feel these arm muscles pump. But you're not trying to do this and you're not trying to do this. Those muscles cross the shoulder and they're contracting naturally so that this doesn't happen. Like literally that heavy dumbbell doesn't do this to your shoulder. Okay? To me, this is the beauty and the elegance of the musculoskeletal system. Some of that muscle's pull is translatory. Translation, this bone into that bone. That sounds really great for stability, right? To make sure that these things stay connected. And then some of that muscle's pull is perpendicular. So in other words, the parallel component of that muscle's pull, really important for stability. But stability alone isn't going to rotate me, because the stability component is parallel. The perpendicular component of that muscle's pull, that is the moment. That is the rotational component. It's only a component of that muscle's pull that's actually trying to make you flex and extend. And I'll give you an example of what I'm babbling about. Has anybody ever seen the trick where you put your hands together and you squeeze and then someone comes and knocks it off? Has anybody ever seen that trick before? Let me see if I could do it. Okay. All right. Put your up, down, right? Now, you notice I didn't try to do this. I didn't try to pull apart. What did I do? I gave force in the side to side. His force was here. I gave a force like that. Try to do. Come on, get it strong. I'm a halt. Come on, one more time. They look like cheating. But it's a great way to win a beer or, root beer. Guys, think about it. You know so much. You do. You know so much. If I took 75-pound dumbbells, there's no way I'm doing this. There's no way I'm doing this. But you know what I can do? I can do this. See what I'm saying? There's a difference between rotational and linear. So what I'm trying to show you with that example, how you were supplying an up-down force, but my force to you was across. Has anybody ever seen someone pull something heavy, like with a chain, like a car or a plane, right? They're pulling it, and they're just showing these great feats of strength by pulling these wheeled vehicles. Anybody seen that before? And my wife would be like, "Are you impressed with that?" And I'm like, "Nah, I want to see him lift it up. Pick the plane up." That'll impress me. So here's my point. At different ranges of motion, that muscle is going to switch less and less parallel, more and more perpendicular. In other words, one of the reasons you feel so strong in this flex position is that look how perpendicular that force is. That's almost all rotational. As opposed to being down here in a carrying angle where you'd be carrying something heavy, much more that muscle's pull is translatory and only a certain component of it is rotation. So I'm trying to get you to see. Most dislocated elbows happen in a flex position because of that. Because all that muscle is trying to do is do this and not prevent that. So that's important to know. Certain positions will lead an athlete or person to certain injuries because in certain positions there's this trade-off of linear and rotation, stability and mobility. So a moment is composed of two variables. If I don't have it there, write it down. You have to have a linear force. And then the other variable is a perpendicular distance from that force application to the axis of rotation. Not a parallel, a perpendicular. Guys, I am sorry that both of those words start with P, abduction. So think about it. For the same magnitude of force, if I increase the perpendicular distance, I increase the moment. I didn't even have to give more of an effort. This happens all the time. If I gave this door 5 pounds of push, 5 pounds of push, and I can open the door. 5 pounds of push, a little bit better, a little bit easier, a little bit 5 pounds of push, it opens easy. I didn't change my foot. I just changed the perpendicular distance. Who's ever changed a flat tire? My dad taught me the cheater stick method where you take I always keep a pipe in my car because sometimes that wrench is so tight, but you put a piece of pipe on it and it makes rotating really easy. I'm limited to how much force I can give, but with an amplification of distance, I can cheat the system. You're like, well, wouldn't that be levers and leverage? Yeah, they're all related. But the key thing is understanding moments, rotational force. So let's go back to our original analogy. I have 20-pound dumbbells here. The force is 20 pounds. But as I raise them up, notice they get further and further and further away from my axis of rotation. The component of that 20 pounds gets more and more and more perpendicular. That's why it's hard. The weight stayed the same, but the moment increased. Make sense? As I lower them down, weight stays the same, but the moment decreased. Until down here, there is no moment. We do things in 310. What's the external force trying to do to you? Well, if it's not trying to rotate you, there's no moment. 20-pound dumbbell, it's not that there's not 20 pounds, it's just that 20 pounds is parallel to my shoulder axis. It's not trying to rotate my shoulder. It's trying to dislocate my shoulder. But it's not trying to rotate my shoulder. So guys, how do we apply this to the real world? Know that in fitness, rehab exercise, it's not the weight, it's the moment. And anything in life has trade-offs. Where are my football fans? Anybody football fans, like real hardcore? All right, we'll talk about something that y'all gonna understand. Hopefully everybody understands. Injuries suck in sports, right? You know, you got a favorite team, a favorite player, your best player gets hurt. So one train of thought is, during spring training or fall camp, we need to protect our assets and not go too hard because we don't want, you know, Joe Burrow, or I'm not even going to say David Carr, Alvin Kamara. We don't want them to get hurt before the season starts. But what's the trade-off of that? Well, if you don't condition them, if you don't sharpen that iron when the season starts, maybe they're not in game shape. Maybe they're not on the same page. Maybe the team chemistry is not there because you were kind of going at it from a cautious standpoint. I'm not here to tell you what's right and wrong. I'm here to explain trade-offs. Trade-offs. So let's look at two different exercises that would work the abductor shoulder group. Do we all agree? External forces trying to abduct you. You need abduction pullers. In unit 3, we're going to talk about who those muscles are: deltoid, anterior, middle, posterior, the supraspinatus, and the biceps brachii long. It's a group of muscles that pull in the direction of abduction. I taught you how to recognize them as agonists. Yes? Trade-offs. Dumbbells. Cheap, versatile, affordable, doesn't take up a lot of space. Trade-off with the moment is going to constantly change through the range of motion. What I mean by that is I'm working my abductors. Not here, I'm not. And I'm working them more here. So if I'm working them 0 here and the most here, that means I'm working them less and 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 more and more and more and more. Same weight, but the moment changes. I am not here to tell you that's bad. Not at all. I'm going to teach you how you can manipulate these things. So let's say you're doing rehab or you're working with someone where you need those muscles to be activated in this position. No problem. Reposition them so that the moment is the greatest here. Like we're going to teach you how to reposition. What's the positive about this machine? Well, the moment is going to stay consistent, right? Because the force, unlike gravity, that's the limitation of planet Earth. It pulls down. But the machine can redirect that force to constantly be perpendicular to the arm. Meaning, when I'm down here, the force is trying to do this. And as I come up, the force changes with me. Does that make sense? So the positive about the machine working the abductors is more consistent moment. So in other words, you're working the muscle through more of the entire range of motion. What's the trade-off? What's the negative? I don't know what you think, about $1,000? Maybe more. Probably takes up a lot of space. Right? Some of the best PT clinics, you don't walk in there and there's machines everywhere. Is where are you going to put everything? You have to get creative. You gotta know these different variables and be able to create what you need. It's almost like the difference, and I'm a hypocrite, bro, because I can't cook. But it's almost like the difference between buying a pizza, super convenient, or making your own pizza from ingredients that you have, right? So a lot of places, and also guys, I'm trying to emphasize this too, because we don't know where we're going to work. And you can't always rely for the places you work to have certain resources. You got to figure stuff out. When I was at Southern Miss, we didn't have money. You had to make stuff out of the toolkit you had. My roommate came from Florida State. They had money for everything. And he's like, well, where's this? Where's that? I was like, dude, you got to make that. He's like, well, we had this and that and other. I'm like, great. You ain't there no more. The one on the left, the weight stays the same, but the moment changes. Does everybody understand what I mean by that? Harder and harder and harder and harder, easier and easier and easier and easier, even though the weight stayed the same. This one, let's assume that the weights don't touch at the bottom. In other words, you're keeping tension throughout the range of motion. Well, the plates stay the same and the rotational force stays the same. The moment stays the same. It doesn't get harder and harder and harder, easier, easier, easier. It stays consistent. Again, Cam was not here to tell you one is better than the other. I'm here to teach you the trade-offs. Let's look at another one. You could go to someone's house and do home health with this one. Or you could go to a gym and do this one. Let's look at the trade-offs. Let's say this ankle cuff is 10 pounds. And let's say the plate on here is 10 pounds. Let's just pretend that the weight is the same. One way to look at it is the weight trying to flex her knee in this position? No. So that means the moment has to be zero. Think of it like this. If moment is force times perpendicular distance, if there's zero perpendicular distance, it doesn't matter if the force is 1,000,000 pounds. The rotational force is zero. It doesn't matter if I'm pushing into the door with 1,000,000 pounds of force. If none of that component is perpendicular, I'm not trying to open or close the door. That makes sense? So in this, the moment gets greater and greater and greater and greater and greater as I get more and more and more perpendicular. Does that make sense? And the moment gets less and less and less and less and less and less. All that force is parallel. So what if you're a therapist and you're like, I don't have the money or the space to have this. However, I want to work that agonist, those knee extensors, through a full range of motion. What are my options? You got a few options. Manual muscle resistance is an option. In other words, knowing that in this flex position, there's going to be no moment, maybe you give an external force from your push right here so that those muscles can be activated in this position. Another option could be reposition them. Maybe the next set, they start here where the moment is the greatest. And then it gets less and less and less and less and less, more and more and more and more and more. You see how for the same position, here I'm working my quad because gravity's trying to flex me. But in the same position here, I'm not working my quad because gravity is not trying to flex me. All gravity is trying to do is dislocate me. Fixed weight, variable torque, variable moment. Fixed weight, same moment, more consistent moment. Let's think about it. Down here, the force is pushing this way. Here, the force is pushing that way. The force changes as with your range of motion. Does that make sense? not the weight, it's the moment. That is the lesson for today's class. It's not the weight, it is the moment. Think about different, like, check this one out, guys. I love life data. It's like, we all know, we all hate it. Like, let's look at this one. Oh, it's a file. This will be the last point for today. What's great about your face and your effort will show rotational force change. If I'm doing a preacher curl, so in other words, my shoulder is flexed, you know darn well, if I was doing heavyweight for me, might be lightweight for you, or if I'm doing heavyweight for me, it'll go something like this. Kelly Clarkson, and then it'll get easy here. Like here I can rest. You know it. This is where you take a breath. Yeah, I got this, I got this. Oh my God, my arm's about to rip out. It's not the weight. It's the moment. Imagine getting off of us, you take some weight off the squat rack. Here is where you take a breath. This is where it's easy. Why? Because that force is parallel through all of your axes. But once you start doing this, and you start generating torque, perpendicular distance, the force is trying to flex my knees and hips more and more and more and more and more and more. It's easier at the top. That's what I'm trying to teach you guys today. It's not the weight, it's more the moment. And what is moment? The weight or the force times the perpendicular distance. And when that perpendicular distance is 0, that means it's a parallel distance and it's not trying to rotate you. We have to be able to see those things. In physical therapy, y'all seen this before too. It goes back to the little trick I showed you. Someone has dumbbells, right? And they'll have dumbbells. And gravity's only trying to drop us. But they have the dumbbells and they're doing this. X forces influence X motion. Y forces influence Y. If you want to work agonist in this position, you need external forces in that position. Right? Therabands, cables. But that's the kind of stuff that we're kind of getting to. Okay. Any questions about the key points of today? Moment, torque, rotation. Next time you're exercising, think about it. Especially if you're in a cable. If you're doing cable with your arm, saying, where would it be the greatest? If the cable's pulling this way, this is where it would be most perpendicular. Where would it be the easiest? Well, here, all it's trying to do is, you're not really working. You can hold this position all day. You can't hold this position all day. So then you're like, well, wait, if it's easier in this range of motion, what if I want to make it harder in this position? Awesome. Just reposition your body. Where now it's the greatest here. And it gets easier and easier and easier. That's your power. You will be able to start manipulating things if you know the rules of the game. And notice, we didn't have to solve for X. Y'all have a good weekend.